day and welcome to the Learn Extra Spring School program. We are going to be going through some geographical work, and particularly this session is going to focus on people and their places, which is our settlement part of the curriculum. First of all, if we take a look at the board, we will see that you should be able to do a couple of things before attempting to answer any settlement questions. The first one is to explain how settlements are classified. We have two classifications of settlements. We will either look at what we call our rural settlements, or we will look at our urban settlements. Those are the two main classifications of the types of things we will look at under settlement. After deciding whether something is rural or urban, you are to discuss the complexity. So rural settlements generally are not very complex at all, and urban settlements are quite complex and involve a variety of different activities. The size, our rural settlements are generally quite small as opposed to urban settlements which are far larger. And the function, when we look at the function of settlements, the main function of rural settlements is to be unifunctional, which means grade 12s that they focus on one specific activity, and our urban settlements are multifunctional, which means they occupy more than one activity. We will also compare and discuss the functions of rural and urban settlements. So like we've just mentioned now, the main functions of our rural areas would be things like farming, fishing, forestry or mining. And the main functions of our urban settlements is anything to do with the secondary and tertiary sectors. The secondary sector involves the manufacturing of goods, and the tertiary sector involves the service provision with those goods that have been made in the secondary and farmed in the primary sector. We also have to look and discuss the tensions between the rural and the urban settlements and the strategies implemented to deal with these. The main tensions that exist between urban and rural settlements is things like people wanting to leave the rural areas to live in the cities. We also look at why cities become so overcrowded and therefore force people out of those cities. So all those kind of tensions is what's looked at under settlement. It is now time for us to look at some questions that were posed in last year's final matric paper, go through the solutions and see how we can start to answer these. So our first question, question 1, you can see it comes from the November 2012 question paper, and obviously most of our settlement questions will either be from question 3 or question 4. The diagram says, study the figure below which illustrates a number of different settlements. So if we look at the diagram, we will see we've got different labels, we've got different information portrayed to us in a key. It is very, very important, grade 12s, to read the information that is given in the key, as it'll often help you to try and understand exactly what is being asked in the particular question. The question that is based on the diagram above simply asks you to match the letters A to E on the figure to the type of settlement listed below. So you literally are going to write down the number and the correct letter which refers to the statement given. Our first statement given, they are looking for a linear settlement. So if we go back to the diagram, we can see our different settlements. We've got C over at the top here, we have B, there's D, E, and A. Now, which one of those 5 is typically representing a linear settlement? A linear settlement comes from the word line and therefore is looking for settlements in the shape of a line. If you go to your key, you will see the settlements are indicated with a white dot, and therefore if we look at the diagram, settlement D is located along the road which forms a linear settlement. Linear settlements can either be along a road, they could be along a river or even a railway line, and therefore our linear settlement is label number D. Our next question they're asking is for a dry point settlement. Now, it's very important for you to understand the difference between a dry point settlement and a wet point settlement. A dry point settlement refers to a dry area within a particularly wet sort of looking place. a wet point settlement would be a spring or an oasis or a river that is found in a particularly dry area. And obviously, if it's the only water source, people would tend to cluster around that source. Unfortunately, we're not looking for a wet point. We are being given a dry point. So if we go back to our diagram, and we look at our various options given, and we particularly focus in here on label number A, you will see that it's a gravel mound in a marshy area. So that would be a dry spot within a particularly wet area, making it our dry point site. 1.3, it asks us to match our break of bulk point. And the most important thing to understand with a break of bulk settlement is where one transport method is changed for another transport method. So if we take a look at our diagram, and we look here at settlement E, you will notice that this is the road area, and it changes into a railway line, and then the transportation changes again because there is a harbour there. So it is actually a three-way change of transport patterns, making settlement E our break of bulk point. So literally speaking, the break of bulk refers to a settlement where one mode of transport is changed for another. All right, we've got a specialized town and a defensive site left, and obviously we have only got two labels that we haven't used. We haven't used label B, and we have yet to use label C. Label C is located on the coastline. They tell you that fishing is going on in that particular area. Fishing is quite a specialized function, and therefore it would make sense then that our specialized town is label C. If you're not too sure that you know label C would be the specialized town, it's very obvious then to see that our last thing, our defensive town, it's generally speaking on top of a high vantage point in an area so that they can look for any attacks that are coming towards the town or city. Settlement B, you can see through the contour lines, okay? It's located on a relatively high point within a certain area. It's a lookout point. So if you did not know that the specialized town was C, you would definitely know that our defensive site was B, and therefore it would make sense then that the specialized town was C. So that was quite an easy two-mark question or two-mark answer per question, and every single time these questions get going, you start with some easier questions first. Okay, moving on. We look at question 2. It says, below is a sketch map showing the land use of a city. Once again, it has given us a whole lot of different labels. We have areas that are commercial, we have wholesale light industry areas, industrial areas, transition zones, high income, middle income, and low income residential areas. And we can see this map is quite complicated, so it is important for us to look at the key given on the particular map to help us with any answers that we may need. The first question that is asked for question 2.2 is account for the location of the CBD labeled A. Now the CBD once again is right in the center of our town, and that's very typical of where a CBD should be located. The CBD stands for Central Business District. And so the question, account for the location. So in other words, account why the CBD has grown and built in the particular area that it is. And if we look, we will notice that a whole lot of transport routes, all these roads, are leading into the city, okay? So there are many ins and outs. It's the most important part of the town. Everybody would like to get in and out of the city. So accounting for the location, one of the reasons you could give is that all the transport routes converge. Converge means they meet in the center. Secondly, you could also have said that the city has a high level of accessibility. It's the most important part of your town, and therefore it needs to be, or people need to be able to get in and out of that town quite easily. Question 2.2. State 2 characteristics of our CBD. So we are now looking at this area that is obviously very centrally located. All the transport routes there lead into that central area, and we are now looking at characteristics of our central business district. First and foremost, the most important characteristic is that the highest land values are found within our CBD. It is the richest piece of land, very expensive to buy land in that area, and that is often the reason why we have so many high-rise buildings in the city centre, because it is far cheaper to build up in terms of multi-story buildings than it is to buy pieces of land adjacent to your current piece. Furthermore, the rentals offered in the city, obviously the people who own the properties are going to charge very high rentals in order to pay for their very expensive piece of land. Also, we can notice that with all the traffic routes converging on the city, we are going to have a lot of traffic congestion in and out of that city centre. It's where everybody wants to be. There's quite a few roads going in, but obviously it's being accessed from all parts of the province. Especially if you look at Johannesburg, we've break it up into a northern side, eastern, western and southern, and all those people on a daily basis try and get into the city centre. There's a lot of high buildings, which I've already mentioned. There is a lot of high order functions, what we refer to as our tertiary or quaternary functions. Those take place within our city centre. And obviously, with the traffic congestion and the a lot of functions being performed there, we are going to have a high concentration of people already. You will notice the mark allocation. It's 2 times 2, which is 4. So they are looking specifically for 2 characteristics, and we have been through far more than 2. The most obvious ones, like I've said again, and I will repeat, it's got the highest land value, a lot of traffic congestion. You can speak about the fact that all the transport routes go in and out of the city, that kind of idea. Okay, and now we're going to move on to question 2.3, which is related to the same diagram that we've been working with. And the question is, which land use zone occupies the largest part of the city? If you are unsure as to what land use zones are, it is the functions that are taking up specific parts of the land within our city and urban environments. And if you just look at the top where we spoke about them earlier, commercial, light industries, heavy industries, transition zone, and our residential areas, whether it be high, middle, or lower income, are all different types of land use zones. And so just by looking at the key and the actual diagram, you will see that it is our residential areas that take up most of the land use. So what they do is they group residential areas together, okay, and that obviously takes up most of the land use of our city. So which land use zone occupies the largest part? You can then write down residential. You don't have to specifically say high, low, or middle, because like I've said before, they have been grouped together. Question 2.4. Land use zone B is the transition zone. Describe 2 factors that give rise to urban decay in this zone. First of all, you need to know that the transition zone is found just in and around the city area. It is over here. If we go back to our diagram, it is labeled with little lines, and so this area is located right around the city fringes here before we get to our low income residential housing. The question specifically asks you to describe 2 factors that give rise to urban decay. Now, it's very important, grade 12s, that you understand what is meant by urban decay. And literally put, it is the how a city has become run down over time, things like graffiti, a lot of broken windows, buildings that have been left behind and no upkeep has taken place. And so when we look for two factors that lead to our city becoming so run down, we look at things like those places are located right next to our low-income residential land use, and those people often are, or there is a lot of overcrowding in those areas. You've got a lot of high-rise apartments where there are far too many people living. The types of activities that are happening in our transition zone, things like prostitution and drugs, those things are leading to the destruction of property in that area. Things like a lot of crime, and that is associated with, once again, our low-income housing. And you might be asking yourself, why is it that the low-income housing is surrounding the CBD? It's because they are the workforce that is needed for tasks that operate in the CBD, and obviously these people are low income earners. They don't have access to cars, they cannot drive into the city center, so they need to live close by. So when we look at those characteristics, there's a lot of things at play here. So it's the low income people, it's the fact that there's a lot of social problems in terms of drugs, prostitution, a lot of crime going on. The buildings and that just don't get renovated over time, so once it gets run down, people don't actually want to rent it, therefore there's no money to fix them up. Any kind of answer like that would work for a question whereby they are implying urban decay. Okay, moving on to question 2.5. Once again, it's still relating to the same diagram, and you will see that in the final exams, quite a few of the questions are based on the same diagram. So once you get to know it and work with it, the question should seem a lot easier. 2.5 says, the greening of cities is becoming increasingly important because of global warming. You should know by now that global warming is referring to the Earth's temperatures getting hotter and hotter, and there has been a move by most city centres to employ this greening concept of building more parks, allowing for more carbon dioxide to be absorbed, a lot of oxygen to be given off, those types of things. So question 2.5a says, what evidence is there that this policy is being implemented? And so if we go back to our diagram, and very obviously right next to the city centre is an enormous park. The evidence that the park is there is showing that this city has become a lot greener. Okay, and it's also indicated by the greening projects, okay, which have been given another symbol. There's greening projects all over the urban area, as well as the park that is located in the city centre. 2.5b, discuss two advantages of greening cities. So why is it important for us to have these parks and these green areas within a city centre? Number one, most importantly, green areas reduce a lot of pollution. And coincidentally, in terms of reducing pollution, they often give off a lot more oxygen in and around the city centre too. They have aesthetic value, which means that they are pretty to look at, so it's calming for people who work in the city centre. They lower our temperatures because pollution, or CO2, absorbs a lot of the heat that is given off in our city centres, and if that pollution or carbon dioxide has been absorbed by our greener areas, the heat of our cities is going to go down as well. Some other ideas, the green areas, they usually form part of what's called our green belt zone, where no urban expansion can take place, so it prevents the development of further city buildings in that, which once again would add to the heat of our city. It gives us recreational activities, so people who are at work and need a break from the office can go down to these green areas and obviously sit and enjoy the environment around them. All right, now it's time for us to take an ad break. We will see you after the ad break with more exciting settlement questions. Hello and welcome back from the ad break. It's now time to continue with some more settlement questions. Just a reminder that these settlement questions are all from last year's final paper written in November. So question 3 then says, many people are abandoning or leaving their farms to go and live in the big cities. The very first question that is asked with this statement is, what is the movement of people from the farms to live in the big cities? Please remember that when they are referring to our farms, they are actually referring to our rural areas. And obviously, when they speak about the cities, they are referring to our urban areas. So they are now looking for the movement of people out of the rural areas towards the city centres, and this concept, grade 12s, is called rural-urban migration. Okay, there is no other definition or concept for it. You have to specifically say that it's rural to urban migration. Migration obviously refers to the fact that people are leaving the rural areas and heading towards the cities. Question 3.2. It says, suggest 2 push factors resulting in people abandoning or leaving their farms. So they are specifically looking for things that are causing people to leave the rural areas and obviously head for a better life in the cities. So things like the fact, most importantly, we have a lot of natural disasters in our rural areas, which will force people to lose their jobs as they can no longer be employed, and therefore they lose their jobs and they head towards the cities to find work. Please be very careful, grade 12s. You cannot say that a push factor pushing them out of the rural areas is the attraction of a better job. That is a pull factor from the urban side, and you cannot use it as a push factor. So rather say things like the natural disasters have occurred, it has caused the people to lose their jobs, and therefore they head to the city to seek further employment. Service delivery in our urban areas, things like schooling, medical services, those are all very, very bad in the rural areas, and therefore it would be something that would encourage people to move from the rural towards the urban areas. Things like, let's just think about very, very important, is when our farms become mechanized. Okay, mechanized implies the use of machinery on our farming areas, and therefore if we get a machine to do the job of 4 people, it really doesn't mean those people need to be employed anymore. Once again, they're going to lose their job. Also, farm consolidation. Okay, so farm consolidation speaks about the fact that little farms are joined together into one big farm, and therefore these people probably once again will end up by losing their jobs. Some other ideas that we can look at is a lot of crime happening in our rural areas, which obviously will force a lot of people to leave those areas and search for a better life. Particularly low lack of schooling, lack of further education, those things are definitely going to drive young people away from the rural areas. But very important, please be careful to ascertain whether they are asking you for push or for pull factors. If they want to know the pull factors, they're asking for things that will attract the people to live in the city. But in this particular question, they are asking us for the push factors, which are going to force people away from the rural area. Right, our next question. State 2 negative effects that this movement is likely to have on the cities. Now, once again, grade 12s, this is a very important question that a lot of us sometimes get wrong because we actually read the question wrong. We are looking for negative impacts on the city centres as a result of all the people moving from the rural areas to the cities. Another question that could be posed is what negative effects are left in the rural areas. So these questions are very similar, and therefore it is very, very important that you read the question and highlight what you are specifically being asked. So for example here, negative effects that the cities are going to have. And obviously the most important, or the one that first pops into your mind, is with everybody moving to the city center, we are going to have a lot of overcrowding in the city center. Okay, now that overcrowding would lead to things like shortage of housing. Okay, so shortages of housing. Another problem with so many people moving into the city centers is that our services battle to cope. So electricity supply is obviously going to be quite under a lot of pressure if there's a lot of people moving into the cities. Our water supplies are going to be affected. We are going to have a lot of traffic congestion with so many people moving into the cities. We will have an increase in pollution with a lot of people now moving into the city centers. And furthermore, we are going to have things like crime, okay, which is going to prove to be a big problem for our city centres. And therefore, there's also going to be a question probably based on the fact that what kind of solutions can we implement? So these are all the ideas that you need to keep in mind. All right, as part of question 3, they have, or in terms of what they do in the final papers, is they always give you a paragraph question to answer. And that paragraph question is very, very important because it is worth a lot of marks. And therefore, if you don't understand what the question is asking you to do, it's very difficult to write down 6 relevant points. And so you need to have a good understanding of the question. The one from last year's paper says the following: sustainable measures are necessary to encourage people to remain in the rural areas. So we've just looked at this whole question of how the people are moving from the rural areas to live in the cities. We have looked at why those people are leaving the rural areas. We have looked at the negative effects associated with so many people moving to the cities. And now the question is, we've got to come up with suggestions as to how we can keep a lot of people living in the rural areas. Write a single paragraph, approximately 12 lines, outlining some ideas for the government to reduce rural depopulation. Now, rural depopulation, as opposed to rural urban migration, is very different. Rural depopulation refers to basically the declining number of people living in the rural areas, whereas rural to urban migration was the movement of the people from the rural to the urban areas. Right, so some ideas now that we're going to look at as to how to answer this question. And simply put, we are looking for strategies to try and encourage people to stay in the rural areas, or alternatively get other people from the urban areas to go and locate themselves within those rural areas. All right, so let's go through some of our solutions. So our solutions now for this idea as to how and encourage people to stay in the rural areas, or encourage further people to move to those rural areas. Number 1, we can attract commuters. Commuters, grade 12s, are people who work in a particular place but live in another environment. So for example, the best example in Johannesburg is how a lot of people have homes at Hartbeespoort Dam, which would be considered a rural environment, but they're actually working in Johannesburg CBD. So they live out in a rural area and they commute into the city every so often for their work purposes. So attracting commuters would help to develop and encourage growth in rural areas. Attract retired people. Okay, so people who are tired of living in the city life, the busy, the fast pace, they can go and live in these rural areas where it's quiet and it's peaceful. And also in terms of their status, retired people don't have a lot of money, and therefore it might also be cheaper for them to live in the rural area. Number 3, Create employment opportunities in the rural areas. That's possibly one of the most important ones, is to create employment. A lot of the time, the people are leaving the rural areas because they have no money, and that leads them back into the poverty cycle, and they have no way of breaking this other than to employ them in some form or other. Provide education and training to our farmers. All right, a lot of our farmers in the rural areas don't have the right techniques. They practice bad farming methods, so they often don't get a good surplus from what they have planted, which will ultimately lead to a crop failure for them, having to let people go, unemployment statistics rise. So if we can educate and train our farmers in terms of how the farming should actually be done, that would be a good solution, and to encourage them to stay in the rural areas. Our next point, develop transport infrastructure to attract industrial and commercial activities. If you think about why industrial areas are located close to the central business district, it is because they have access to the transport networks. So if the transport infrastructure was developed further, these companies, especially heavy industrial areas, need a large piece of land which is often located in our rural areas. Organize festivals and sporting events so as to promote rural towns. So have some sort of function going on in that area and encourage the people to go to that place. Provide basic needs for the rural people. When we talk about our basic needs, we're talking about housing in the form of shelter. We're talking about food, and we are referring to water. Especially of those three, the provision of housing and the provision of water supplies are very, very essential in order to keep people living in a specific area. Improve service delivery, things like waste removal, once again back into flushing water, that kind of thing, provision of electricity. Those are all services which these rural areas require in order to encourage people to stay there. Improve working conditions and salaries. Often you will find that also one of the main reasons people leave the rural areas is because they are paid very low wages. And therefore, if we can sort of increase those salaries and wages to a decent amount, it might encourage the people to stay behind. Improve access to capital for farmers. In other words, capital to buy machinery, capital to buy drought-resistant seeds, capital to irrigate their farmlands. Those kinds of things will improve the farming of those rural areas and hopefully encourage the people to stay. Plant drought-resistant crops. People then are not unemployed during droughts, especially in South Africa, which is considered to be a semi-arid desert according to the amount of rainfall we receive. Drought-resistant crops are a very good idea to stop unemployment in the rural areas. Use scientific methods to monitor environmental conditions. The specific environmental conditions I would imagine they are referring to is any type of flooding, okay, and any type of droughts. Those two are the most important natural disasters that can affect South Africa, and especially our rural communities. Communal ownership of land to be changed to individual ownership to improve production. In other words, if the farmer is given the opportunity to own his piece of land, he hopefully will be encouraged to work a lot harder and produce goods of a much higher quality. By providing low-interest loans to potential farmers, therefore they don't have a huge debt and they can start the farming business. By providing entertainment, okay, that's an important one. And also for the question we looked at earlier, one of the push factors from the rural areas is that there's nothing for those people to do in the rural areas. And therefore they leave to live in the cities where there's movies to watch, or they can go bowling, or they can go to restaurants. So providing entertainment in these rural areas would also hopefully encourage them to stay. And lastly, land reform policies, and the two examples that you study in matric is GEAR and the RDP, whereby they take previous land that was owned by others and they give that land to new people. Now, any 6 of those answers would get you your 12 marks for your paragraph question. It's important to make sure that if they have asked you to write a paragraph, that you take these various points and you join them all together nicely into a short, quick paragraph. All right, after question 3, we will now be taking another ad break and we will see you after that. Welcome back from that ad break. It's now time to look at our last 2 questions for the day, and so we will move on to question 4. Question 4 says, the figure below shows the position of informal settlements in the city of Nairobi in Kenya. And we've got a beautiful diagram, and the question asked says to describe the location of the informal settlements. If we look back at the diagram that's given to us, you will see that all the informal settlements are located on the edges of your cities. And for describing the location, that is a perfect answer, is that basically they are on the edges of the built-up area. Okay, our second question says, name 2 social problems associated with these settlements. Okay, now obviously our informal settlements, the people that are living there have got no jobs, okay, they don't have running water, there is a lot of overcrowding, and things like this are happening in our informal settlements. So what's important is, I think, that you look at your mark allocation and you will see it says 2 by 2. So they're looking for 2 social problems. And those social problems, it could be crime, it could be overcrowding. Those for me would be the 2 main answers to a question like that. Staying with question 4 and staying with our same diagram, it says suggest 2 measures that can be put in place to improve the lives of people living in the informal settlements. And most importantly, to improve the lives of people that are literally living with nothing is the provision of services. And quite nicely here, or quite easily, you can say provide electricity, provide water, okay? And all of those are under the heading of provide basic services. Provide schooling so that those people can become educated and move on to better things in terms, or instead of living in an informal settlement. Okay, so with this question, look for the most important things. Obviously, providing services is particularly relevant, providing electricity, water, providing schooling, providing jobs to the people that are in those areas to get them better off and obviously can be able to move out of those areas. Our 4th question, explain why both the Matare River and the Ngong River are likely to be polluted. Well, we've spoken about it before, okay? These informal settlements are located along those rivers, and because they do not have access to basic services like running water, they make use of the rivers in order to do their washing, their daily hygiene, those types of activities. And obviously, as a result of that, pollution in those rivers is going to be on the increase. So going back to our question, explain why they're likely to be polluted, is basically, like I've spoken about, they're going to dump waste into the river, their raw sewage will go into the river, and these items would obviously cause pollution in those areas. Our 5th question related to the same diagram. In post-apartheid South Africa, a number of land reform policies have been put in place to solve the problems associated with the shortage of land. Name 2 of these policies. We've got land redistribution, we have land restitution, we have land tenure, in order to try and encourage previously disadvantaged people to own land that has now become available for them to own. Okay, that brings us to question 5, which is our last question for this section on settlement. And if we look at question 5, it says, study the figure below, which shows a model of an unsustainable city. You are going to find in the final exams that they're going to focus a lot on the sustainability of a city because it is the way the world is working. So it says here, we have a model of an unsustainable city. We have food, we've got coal, nuclear, oil, energy going in. We have goods and services. Those are all our inputs into our city. And our outputs are things like organic waste dumped into rivers, dumped into our coastal waters, greenhouse gas emissions, which is becoming vitally important, non-organic waste dumped into the rivers at refugee dumps. Explain what you understand by the term or a sustainable city. Okay. So like I said, the big move has been towards this idea of a sustainable city. And basically, it's a city that will improve the quality of life of people living in that city and any future generations to come. So what's happening in that city is not going to cause harm to any future generations that may be around for years to come. Okay, moving on to question 5.2, name 2 factors that are going to make a city unsustainable. And very, very important, the main thing that should pop into your mind is air pollution. Air pollution in terms of the release of CO2 are making all cities around the world very unsustainable. Things like population growth is making our cities unsustainable because the cities are not able to cope with the amount of people that is now living in those particular areas. Things like pumping waste into our rivers, okay? We are lucky in Johannesburg that it's one of the only cities that is not located on a major river. But most other cities around the world are, and therefore if we pump waste into these areas, they are making those cities unsustainable. But number one for me, air pollution and population growth are causing these cities to actually start to have a lot of problems. Okay, question 5.3. Suggest 2 measures that a city can employ to become more sustainable. And this is where your whole idea of things like alternate energy, okay? So instead of using a lot of coal and electricity productions, we can look for more renewable sources of energy within a city. We can also look at things like public transport. If people use public transport, then they are going to reduce the effect on our city centres with the amount of carbon dioxide that they are giving off. We can control the amount of litter, okay? A lot of litter, it doesn't look good for our cities. It also creates a lot of further problems. These are the measures that people can employ to become more sustainable. So have campaigns whereby the litter is picked up, encourage students to get involved, those kind of ideas. There are obviously a lot of solutions that cities can do to encourage the city to become far more sustainable. Okay, moving on. Our last question for the day is once again a paragraph question. And I've already spoken to you about how important it is to understand what is needed or required from that question before you attempt to write your paragraph. So if we look at our last question, it says, write a single paragraph, approximately 12 lines, outlining the effects of pollution on the health, environment, and the economy of a city. Now, this is quite a nice paragraph question because they have specifically laid out what they are looking for. They want how pollution is going to affect people's health. They want to know how it affects our environment, and they want to know what impact that will have on the economy. And if you just break the question down like that, you will see that there are 3 topics that you can write about and mention 2 points on it. And very importantly, I must point out that you could possibly mention 3 points on how pollution affects people's health, and 1 from environment and 2 from economy, as long as you have mentioned a point on each specific thing that's been asked. So you must answer 1 point on health, 1 point on the environment, and 1 point on the economy, and then the rest, it does not really matter as long as you have 6 points in total. Okay, so if we go and look at our solutions, I will point out exactly whether it's affecting our health, our environment, or our economy. And it is quite nicely broken down. You will see that they first start off with the effects on the health, which is what the question was referring to. High stress levels, okay? So pollution is going to make the city an unpleasant place. It's going to cause people to be upset, and therefore our stress levels will get out of control. In a lot of places like China and Bangkok, the people drive around the city wearing masks, okay? Because the pollution in that city is so thick. Air pollution causes problems such as asthma and cancer. So those are relevant problems to people's health that they may want to avoid from working in a city. Waterborne diseases, okay? Anything that could move in water in a form of pollution. So things like typhoid, okay, is a waterborne disease that will move through a city and cause a great amount of problems. Effects on our environment. Acid rain, which affects the growth of plants. Acid rain is caused by too much pollution in the Earth's atmosphere, and when it rains, the rainwater collects all that acid and it reaches the Earth's surface as acid rain. Destruction of our ecosystems. Enormous amounts of CO2 are playing a huge role in the development of photosynthesis, okay? That is a major part of most ecosystems, is the production of food, and obviously now the abundance of carbon dioxide is going to have a huge impact on these ecosystems. Increasing global warming. The carbon dioxide in the form of pollution absorbs a lot of the heat. That's the characteristic of carbon dioxide, and it retains that heat and causes the Earth's temperatures to warm up. Land pollution spreads diseases, pests, and rodents, okay? Water pollution, which will result in the growth of algae, which causes aquatic ecosystems to be destroyed due to the lack of oxygen. These answers are pretty much self-explanatory. Pollution over the city increases our temperatures at night. You would remember that from your climatology section where they refer to urban heat islands. Okay, so the urban heat island has a greater effect at night due to the amount of pollution over that city center. Acid rain destroys building structures. Okay, it actually starts to eat away at the concrete and that has been used for those buildings, and therefore there is a variety of environmental problems which you can write as part of your paragraph. Then our last one is the effects on our economy. Okay, so how does pollution actually influence our economy? If we have to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide, we will have a drop in productivity. So industrial areas would have to reduce the amount that they are producing in order to reduce the carbon dioxide levels. Creates additional costs for the economy. If we have too much pollution, that kind of thing, it presents itself and creates a whole host of other problems and negative effects, which will end up costing the country money. They need to look after the people that have been affected in terms of the asthma and the cancer. Negative effect on tourism. It's not great to go to a country where there's loads of pollution and you are battling and struggling to breathe within the city center. Increased pressure on health facilities, those health facilities that are sponsored by the taxpayers and hospitals that belong to the country, those are put under severe pressure with the amount of diseases and things that the pollution has actually caused. Medical aid contributions rise and increase in medical costs. So there's quite a number of options that you need to give in order to successfully answer the last paragraph question. But like I've said to you before, when we're going through it, this one is nice and easy because it is broken up into 3 separate sections. That now brings us to the end of our people and places and our settlement task for the spring program. We hope you've enjoyed it and we look forward to seeing you soon.